The iron gates of St. Hill graveyard groaned. A symphony of rust echoed through the still night, as if the gates themselves were lamenting the souls they guarded. They whispered tales of countless sleeps beneath the earth, each grave a silent story of lives once lived, now forgotten by time. Moss-covered headstones stood like crooked teeth, jagged and worn by the passage of years, each one a marker of a soul's final resting place. Shadows stretched long and gnarled from the cypress trees, like grasping claws reaching out to ensnare the unwary. The trees, ancient and twisted, seemed to guard the secrets of the dead. The scent of damp earth and decaying leaves hung heavy, a silent testament to the cycle of life and death. Each breath taken in this place was a reminder of nature's relentless march forward. The moon, obscured by a veil of clouds, cast an eerie, pale glow upon the weathered stones. Its light, though faint, illuminated the names and dates etched into the gravestones, a ghostly reminder of those who once walked the earth. A low wind howled through the graveyard, whistling a mournful tune through the trees. The sound was both haunting and beautiful, a dirge for the departed. The air grew cold, sending shivers down the spines of those brave or foolish enough to wander among the graves. The mist thickened, wrapping around the tombstones like a shroud. It was a place of whispers and shadows, where the line between the living and the dead blurred. The fog seemed to come alive, forming shapes and figures that danced just beyond the edge of vision, leaving one to wonder if they were truly alone. James, the new graveyard keeper, scoffed at the tales. Superstition, he thought, the product of idle minds. He was a practical man, unmoved by ghost stories and eerie sounds. His world was one of logic and reason, a place where the living concerned themselves with the tangible, not the spectral. He had taken the job at St. Hill for its solitude, its peace, or so he thought. He preferred the company of the silent stones to the clamour of the living. Their quiet slumber offered a comforting constancy, a stark contrast to the unpredictable chaos of the world beyond the graveyard walls. One crisp autumn evening, as the sun began its descent, James noticed something amiss. A patch of freshly turned earth marred the otherwise undisturbed landscape of St. Hill. It was a grave, recently dug, but strangely unmarked. No headstone, no flowers, no name to identify the soul it held. Curiosity piqued, James approached the grave cautiously. The air around it seemed to crackle with an unseen energy, sending a prickle of unease down his spine. He knelt, running a hand over the cold, damp earth. It was then that he heard it, a faint scratching sound emanating from beneath the surface. James froze, his heart pounding heavily in his chest. The scratching grew louder, accompanied by a muffled thumping sound, like someone desperately trying to break free from the earth. Panic welled up inside him, threatening to overwhelm his usual pragmatism and calm demeanor. Could it be an animal? No, it was too rhythmic, too deliberate to be an animal. It sounded almost human. He listened intently, every nerve on high alert, straining to hear. Then a voice, faint and choked, filtered up through the earth, barely audible. "Help me!" it whispered, sending chills down James's spine. His breath caught in his throat. This was no animal, he realized. Someone or something was buried alive, struggling to escape. Section 5. An empty sepulchre. Panic gave way to a surge of adrenaline, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest. James scrambled back, grabbing a nearby shovel with trembling hands, his mind racing with fear and determination. He began to dig furiously, the cold earth offering little resistance. Each thrust of the shovel a desperate attempt to reach the source of the cries. With each heave of the shovel, the cries grew louder, more desperate, echoing in the still night air. He dug until his hands bled. the pain barely registering in his frantic state, until the coffin lid was finally exposed. His breath hitched in his throat as he pried it open, expecting to find a terrified face staring back at him, the source of the haunting cries. But the coffin was empty, a chilling void where he expected to find life. A wave of dizziness washed over James, his mind struggling to comprehend the eerie silence that followed. The scratching had stopped, the cries silenced, leaving an oppressive stillness in the air. He was surrounded by the still silence of the graveyard, the only sound his own ragged breathing echoing in the emptiness. It was as if the earth had swallowed the voice, leaving behind an unnerving emptiness, a void that seemed to stretch into eternity. Section 6. The Unseen Occupant. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the graveyard in an inky blackness, broken only by the pale light of the emerging moon. Shadows stretched long and twisted, creating an eerie atmosphere that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. James stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the empty coffin, his mind reeling. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the cold night breeze. The rational part of him screamed for an explanation, but the primal fear that coiled in his gut told him there was no logical answer to be found. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing like a drum in the stillness. He felt a presence behind him, cold and unseen. It was as if the very air had turned to ice, sending shivers down his spine. He didn't dare turn around, his eyes fixed on the gaping maw of the empty grave. The darkness within seemed to beckon him, whispering secrets he couldn't quite hear. The air grew thick and heavy, making it difficult to breathe. A dense fog began to roll in, wrapping around the tombstones like ghostly fingers. He could feel eyes on him, watching, judging. The sensation was so intense that he could almost see the invisible gaze piercing through him. He was no longer alone in the graveyard. The unseen occupant had made its presence known, and James knew that whatever it was not of this world. Section 7. The Shadow of the Cypress Tree. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he saw it. A long, inky shadow stretching out from beneath the gnarled branches of the ancient cypress tree that loomed over the freshly dug grave. It was not the shadow of a tree, nor of any earthly creature he could identify. It was shapeless, yet somehow solid, writhing and pulsing with a life of its own. Terror, primal and consuming, seized James. He stumbled back, his foot catching on the edge of the grave. He fell, landing hard on the cold earth. As he looked up, the shadow began to move, flowing towards him like liquid darkness. Section 8. Confronting the Ethereal Presence. James scrambled to his feet, backing away from the approaching shadow. His mind raced, searching for a rational explanation, a way out. But there was nowhere to go, no escape from the encroaching darkness. He was trapped, alone with whatever entity haunted this hallowed ground. As the shadow reached him, it began to rise, swirling around him like a macabre dance partner. He could feel its coldness seeping into him, chilling him to the bone. It was then that he heard the voice again, this time closer, whispering in his ear, "You should not have disturbed my rest." Section 9. A ghastly transformation. Panic gave way to a strange sense of calm. It was as if the entity was leeching away his fear, replacing it with something colder, something hollow. He felt his own body begin to change, his skin growing pale and cold, his breath misting in the air. His reflection in the polished surface of a nearby headstone was no longer his own, but a grotesque mockery of life. He reached out, his hand passing through the solid granite as if it were smoke. He was no longer entirely of this world, caught somewhere between life and death, claimed by the entity that ruled this night. Section 10. The Vanishing. The next morning, the rising sun cast long shadows across St. Hill graveyard. The air was crisp and clear, the only sound the gentle chirping of birds. But the peace was deceptive, for something was amiss. The freshly dug grave remained, a gaping wound in the earth, but the shovel lay abandoned nearby. And of James, the pragmatic caretaker, there was no sign. He was gone, vanished without a trace, swallowed by the earth and the shadows. The only evidence he had ever existed was the faint chill in the air and the lingering sense of unease that clung to the graveyard, a silent testament to the night the earth claimed its own.